I too was impacted by Campus Crusade. And he was a student at Fuller Theological Seminary. So we can connect the dot with, you can cover 80s, 90s, so that current Fuller seminarians can connect the historical dots. I invited him to just speak, maximum 15 minutes. Thank you.
Where's my timekeeper? But it's okay. A little bit about me. I'm a practitioner of practitioners. I went to a very prestigious school, if you know about it. It's called Cal State LA. That's where I went. I'm a practitioner. Matter of fact, I was a little vulgar, but I was in the restroom a while back, and I had my Cal State LA shirt on or something, and I was using the restroom. And this guy comes in with his UCLA shirt, and he goes, looks at me and his Cal State, he sees my Cal State LA logo, and he goes, well, at UCLA, we're taught that we wash our hands after we use the restroom. And I go, yeah, at Cal State LA, they teach us not to use a restroom on our hands. So anyway, there's a little different word I usually use, but anyway, I just appreciate this time, Isaac, Tim, and Dr. Mellon Fuller Seminary to put this on, and truly this is an amazing gathering the largest gathering I know of Asian American leaders and academics in this type of arena, and it's a huge, huge deal. My brief history at Fuller: I grew up with a parallel universe with Ben Shin. We were born the same year. We traveled together in Pasadena, but we never met each other until fairly recently, which is really weird. All the same restaurants, all the same eateries, and we talk a lot about that. But it's been really fun. And my first impression of Fuller Seminary is the 1970s, believe it or not, as a consumer of the leadership that was developed at Fuller Seminary. Some of the leaders, some of my youth pastors at Fuller attended Fuller, and they actually invited me and snuck me in a couple of classes in the late 70s, early 80s. And as the Lord called me into ministry, I chose Fuller, and I chose Fuller primarily because I could ride my bike here. No, but really it was an issue that I was appreciative of their leadership, their biblical acumen, and their character, and that's one of the reasons why I chose Fuller. And then I actually attended as a student from 1988 to 1994 on an MDiv track. About halfway through it, God called me as the director of AACF, Asian American Christian Fellowship. So I stepped out of school for several years and didn't finish my degree until 2002. Basically, I was after an M anything at that point, and they were able to allow me to go back to school, and I got an MA in Intercultural Studies, which was providential in my studies and my passion in mission. I currently serve as a national director of the EPIC Movement, which is Campus Crusade's Asian American ministry. And to understand Campus Crusade, yes, it is pretty white. Matter of fact, if you look at the statistics on how you want to look at it, if you looked at it of 27,000 workers worldwide, only 100 are Asian American. Now, there are Asians in Asia, but only 100 people that we know serve in the Campus Crusade organization. So you kind of understand what I'm up against. And it's been a great, great time of having the ear of the leadership of Campus Crusade and understanding the scope that they want to reach in terms of the Asian Americans in the United States. I've experienced Fuller in many different ways, pen and paper, PC, and then now PDAs. So it's kind of a fun little transition of technology. During the time, I've seen tremendous demographic shifts in the Asian American community. In the 70s and 80s, it's pretty much Japanese and Chinese here. That was it. And then we see an influx in the 80s and 90s. We see the Koreans, a few Southeast Asians, a rise in Filipinos. But now, what's the next generation of Asian Americans? And I'm amiss to see that there aren't very many Southeast Asians here. My brother Ken and a couple other folks. But the Cambodians, the Hmong, the Thai, the Mien, the Indonesian, the South Asians, where are they in this dialogue? And you know what, Asian American folks, my brethren here, if we're not looking out for them as Asian Americans, if we're not responsible, if I could say, for our brethren, who will be? And can you imagine our churches, what they would look like if somebody mentored us 20, 30 years ago in this process of seminary education and growth. If we are not the advocates for minority Asian groups, nobody will be. So I stand as a bridge person between actually 30 years of Asian American history. It's kind of weird. I say maybe just Ben, mid-40s. I say mid, I'm not late 40s, Ben. Where's Ben? With the initial rush of Asian American students in the 90s, 70s, and 80s, they pastored me and they mentored me. Now, as a minister, as a seminary student in the mid-80s and 90s, kind of that mid thing, and now I am actually the mentor of several students that are at Fuller or at other seminaries around the country. So it's been an interesting part of being a mentee and a mentor to the products of seminary and Fuller. Now, all who have been through Fuller, and I'm talking to a lot of students here, because I know a lot of us are not from Fuller, but the students, I've been challenged academically. My eyesight is ruined with thousands of pages read, fingers cramped with 1 million keystrokes, and my mind has been hopefully extended and challenged and expanded with engaging academicians. I've been enriched socially by meeting current and upcoming world leaders from across the globe. That's been a fascinating time at Fuller. And I've also been understanding how to balance life with academics and theological reflections at the Crown City Brewery, if you know where that is in Pasadena. That's a Fuller thing. Sorry, I know most of us, we don't know where that is. Okay, but all of us, we're stretched in our faith and, our pocketbooks, but it's been a good experience to be at Fuller. But one thing has lacked at my education here, and I think we kind of understand what this is. Seeing the vast wave of Asian American students from the 70s till now, Fuller has really never grasped effectively how to empower or legitimize the Asian American community. I do give credit to Fuller because they've tried. Stanley Noah in the mid-1980s taught a class on Asian American ministries and was a pioneer, the first class ever to talk about Asian American ministries in the 1980s. In the early 1990s, Dr. Ken Fong and Dr. Hertig did a class in Asian American ministry as well, packed, wall-to-wall students. Fuller Seminary has partners with Logo Seminary. It's hired a few Asian American professors, but they taught in specialties that were either too specific or too general to really reach the Asian American scope. Fuller Seminary has had very influential staff and administrators who have served in the provost's office, academic advising, admissions, the Fuller Foundation, psychological services, just to name a few. But we have never had a full-time faculty that was able to address the complex issues and growing issues of the Asian American community. Every few years, there are ad hoc gatherings of Asian American students that cast vision of what could be, but they are merely students kind of just preaching to the choir. It's never really gone outside of that room. The gatherings are great for students, but they are in a way useless until a champion is there at the institution to carry it to the next level. I even met with a potential master's candidate a few months ago who did not walk to receive their diploma in silent, maybe vocal protest of not having an Asian American Studies program here. And I go, you know what? That's not a hill you want to die on. Go ahead and get your skin. But now, we're here at an Asian American Symposium, the best one I know that Fuller has put on. And I would even maybe argue to say the best one anybody's put on. And this is an amazing time. And I'm dreaming again. For there's no viable program in the world that addresses the unique story and prepares students to reach one of the fastest growing people groups in the United States. Some institutions and seminaries have tried, some have had brilliant professors, but there are still few programs. Seminaries are chock full with Asian American students, as we know, but there really hasn't been a viable Asian American Studies program in any seminary in the United States. Is that true? They've tried, but we haven't gotten it off the ground. So I'm in a place of dreaming again. Fuller is in the heart of the largest concentration of Asian Pacific Americans, Asian Pacific Islanders in the world, or in the US. It is the gateway California is the gateway to the Pacific and the Pacific Rim. We are smack dab in the middle of the highest concentrations outside of Asia, of Asians. Could Fuller be the preeminent Asian American Studies department in the world? We need to equip ministers not just to meet the ethnic specific challenges, but multicultural challenges, but actually what I call a thing called polycultural challenges. Now, what the heck is that? Now, you hear of polytheism. Why don't we call it multitheism? Because there's a lot of gods, right? We call it polytheism for a reason, because these polytheists, it's an issue of interaction with each other. And polycultural defined is not just the many, but how those multitudes interact, react in the mix of ethnicity, acculturation, spirituality, family, migration forces, cultural, socioeconomic issues, and generational forces. So it's not just multiple people, but it's how those things interact and mix together. So I call that a polycultural challenge as we look at Asian Americanness. So when I was asked a few months ago, to consider this, I knew Isaac was kind of putting this on. I was excited at it, and I don't know if I really want to go, because we've had gatherings before, and they're just kind of fun, but eh. So Melanie asked me to speak, and I go, well, Melanie, what kind of mucky mucks are going to be here? You know, who's going to be here? Because usually we just, again, preach to the choir. And she said that Dr. Mao is putting this on. Now that's a mucky muck. And so that's a pretty significant time. So Dr. Tran yesterday said, hint, hint, as it related to the Asian Pacific American staff or program, that we need to get it together here, as a hint, hint. And so I would address Dr. Mao, and maybe us too, who will be the champion to be the first, to make this the first viable program in the world, to have a program that addresses the specific needs of Asian Pacific Americans? Will it be Fuller? Have we arrived? Or am I just dreaming?
Thank you, Tommy. And thank you for your long history sketching Asian American history at Fuller Theological Seminary. We videotaped you, so. Well, now, all the breakout conversation and dialogue, churches often revolve around monologue, but we practice the art of dialogue, and it was inspiring to see everybody exchanging without trying to fix somebody. So I figured it would be a good idea to bring moderators, and if you can all line up here quickly and give us since we have to take photos when the president comes in, would you please come up? Where the microphone is, over there. Are those microphones working? Please briefly name your group's topic and then summary.
I'm Jonathan Wu. No, I'm replacing him because he didn't want to come up. So I'm Jonathan Wu. No, my name is Darren Lim, and I'm part of the future generation of pastoral ministry leadership. And we had some good discussion. Originally, actually, Deborah O led us, and then Jonathan took over, and then Jonathan picked me. I don't know why. Maybe because I had the biggest mouth. I don't know. But anyway, we came up with a few suggestions or some conclusions in our two-day discussions from Dr. Tran's sharing, as well as the panel discussions. Just a few of the things that we had came up with for pastoral leadership, whether it's for the future One of them is personal formation. One of the couple of things, that's two parts here. One of them we thought of mentoring relationships, basically a spiritual formation, maybe in a seminary with faculty, the seminarians and faculty meeting with the students, more concerning that. And also, too, maybe seminaries could bring in, I don't know what we meant by seasoned pastors. Maybe that's more than 3 years, whatever but anyway, those who have been there, more practical theology, what they can come in and share with the seminarians what those who've been in the trenches have been going through, and to give them exposure to what they had to face. Also, too, we mentioned right just before we came up to some other experiences that maybe the seminary as well as these pastors can bring up so that they can help prepare the seminarians, such as like how to deal with, which I don't know what church doesn't have any problem people in their churches, but how to deal with that, or overbearing leader, elders or deacons or something like that. But I know no churches go through that. But anyway, but those are things that we thought of. Another one is having increase alumni network. I know that many of us who are in our group at least mentioned that the only time we heard from our seminary is when they need money. Okay, but also to have a gathering about how to improve, especially in this arena of Asian American ministries, whether in pastoral ministries or missions as well. We brought that up as well. And then also, too, thirdly, continuing education opportunities, because I think we thought that the education process for us, at least many of us when we went to seminary, didn't really bring about a lot of the topics which we've just heard today. There's that hint, and we happen to be the ones who actually went to seminary and didn't get it. And so I think continuing education, especially for those who've been in the trenches, to be able to get some of that encouragement or some of that enlightenment or some of that activity that may help us as we go back into our churches in wherever area we were at. Did I say it right, John? Okay.
We also work on the theme of the future of Asian American pastoral leadership. The first thing that we come up with is very confusing. The problem is very confusing because we cannot define what is Asian American pastor. Does the person need to be Asian American, or whether he should be more Asian or more American, or just have a sensitivity to Asian American culture? So we recognize that Asian American church has a very heterogeneous culture in its own. So an Asian American church may have first generation, 1.5 generation, second generation, or third, fourth, fifth generation. So we figure out that it would be ideal in the pastoral leadership of an Asian American church that actually have a composition of a diversified pastoral staff ranging from immigrants to second, fifth generation. And in that, we value the mentoring relationship between these pastoral staff, that maybe the first generation can mentor the second, third generation, and in turn, they would also learn from the second, third generation. So a reciprocal learning relationship between the pastoral staff. And in that relationship, that the pastoral staff actually model for the congregation how they should relate to each other. Not just theoretically speaking, but they embody the spirits of community among the leadership. Contextualization also came out to be a major theme, that Asian American pastors need to learn to live in both worlds and how to reflect upon their own pilgrimage as well as the pilgrimage of their congregation in these two worlds. We figure one of the mission of the Asian American pastors to be the translators of Asian American theology to the white world or the Caucasian world. So not just preaching to the choir, but as well as connecting with the larger world. And then in the second page, we have a full page of recommendations for Fuller. of all these wonderful things that we talked about, we realized that we have to learn from somewhere how to do them. So the first recommendation that we have is to encourage the seminary to nurture or intentionally create a multicultural ethos and consciousness, not just for Asian Americans, but for programs across the board. So for School of Theology, School of Psychology, School of Intercultural Studies. So you don't create just a stream of Asian American studies or Asian American Christianity, but in every classroom, in all the core courses, that would culture a consciousness of learning from different cultures. So say, for example, in a systematic theology class, maybe we should have a panel of different theologians from different places dialoguing with each other instead of just learning from the Western tradition. So it's intentional cultivation of that kind of mentality or ethos in the whole campus or whole of the program. The second recommendation is to provide resources for Asian American churches and pastoral leadership, such as setting up platform like a symposium for the pastoral leadership to come and dialogue, to encourage more congregational research, maybe in the deeming projects or faculty projects, so that we have more content and substance to talk about. The third recommendation is for faculty development, to encourage all the faculty to participate or to have continued education in the areas. And then the last one is in terms of curriculum design, to have faculty team teaching, to encourage students to be exposed to diverse experience and different models, and to nurture mentoring relationship with experienced pastors.
Our group was the future of theological formation in Asian American churches, and forgive me, I was eating lunch and enjoying the company of those at my table. So I'm gonna sort of summarize off of our notes. First off, we went around and reflected on the question of people's experiences when they were in seminary, and in terms of theological formation. And some remarked that while they were here at Fuller, that they had to go elsewhere to reflect upon their cultural context. In doing so, it lacked depth and the discipline that happens in an academic setting. The next thing that we discussed was the very viability of an Asian American theology. Some shared that for many Asians, they've adopted the posture of colorblindness. And so the very notion of an Asian American theology is being contested. And so even moving forward to formulating these ideas, we had to discuss, is this even viable? And I'll speak here, and not to point out one tradition. This is my own tradition, a Korean Presbyterian tradition. I feel that among Korean Presbyterians are very skeptical of this sort of notion of an Asian American theology or contextual theology alone. And so these are challenges and hurdles that within the Asian American community we need to address if we're going to constructively do an Asian American theology and meet these needs. In terms of recommendations for moving forward, we recognize that we need greater opportunities to connect to the past and to move forward. And Tim shared about how some churches in the Bay Area were proactively sharing the past of this particular ethnic congregation and sharing that with its youth and so forth. And some other ideas were suggested that we need to incorporate that into our very worship, and so that this is not just, a museum piece, but that it's at the heart of who we are as God's people. We then went directly to discuss the recommendations for what Fuller could possibly move forward. And one of the recommendations was obviously in regard to faculty, and this has been mentioned before. And thankfully, we have Tim Seng here as an incredible resource and someone who's been in the trenches. And so he knows this stuff. He's been fighting for this stuff. And he recognizes that there's a lot of challenges here. One of which is the fact that many institutions do not have they can't possibly hire someone of every background. That is, you can only have so many faculty members, and to hire some persons of Asian American background and then Hispanic American background, and so that's just a real challenge for institutions to address this, and so that's a hurdle there. There's also a hurdle for those as professors in terms of research. To what degree is these type of things being rewarded by the academy? Are they legitimate? And because the present state is that it is not, as Jonathan spoke about, those who are invested into a theological career and education are not pursuing these matters because they're not being rewarded, quite frankly. And here's a challenge that I have to Dr. Mao and Fuller, is that is this going to be legitimate scholarship? And are you going to go against the trend of current academic scholarship? And I would say that Fuller is merely reflective of the wider academy. And are they going to then acknowledge this as legitimate scholarship? Thirdly, we spoke about institutional values. And I'll just end here, there's many to come. But say, for example, many institutions have embraced that they would require their faculty members to embrace gender inclusivity. At least they would require their faculty members to endorse women in ministry. That is a core institutional value. That is a deal breaker when it comes to hires. Now, is this going to be a deal breaker? Is this going to be a core value by institution upon all their hires? And currently, the sentiment was that it is not. And so that needs to be an institutional value that, in terms of moving forward. Thanks.
My name is Russell Moy, and my group dealt with intergenerational issues, and of course we focused on conflict. And one interesting thing was mentioned to illustrate this was the fact when parents decide to immigrate to this country, their children came along involuntarily. So the parents made the choice voluntarily, but not their kids. And so their kids, of course, have to deal with the tension of living in two cultures. What we'd like to do is we focused on strategies, and I have one for Isaac and one for Fuller. Fuller has a Korean language DMIN program, is that correct? Yes. And they have classes such as in Korean church history, taught by adjunct faculty, please correct me if I'm wrong, who just speak in Korean, and all the readings are in Korean. We had one of our students who is bilingual but had trouble doing the readings in Korean. So we thought of the idea of, can we have a translator who could offer, say, this course in Korean church history as half a class, 2 units, and offer it to Korean Americans or other students interested in Korean church history in English, so that it'd be offered to a wider student body than just the Korean speaking. So if translators could be found who could translate this class into English, then it could be made available to a wider audience. So I think that's somewhat easy and feasible that Fuller could do, is find some translators that could translate these Korean DMIN classes into English and offer it to Korean Americans. Our strategy for Isaac is to sponsor, just like this, a symposium on bridging or crossing the intergenerational divide. So what we envision is Isaac, of course, with the help of Fuller, gather some churches together and offer ways in which the first generation could understand the second generation and vice versa. So we'd have the first generation talk about their stories, tell us about their culture, and then have the second generation tell about their experience and their experiences living in this country. And this would be a pan-Asian event, because I know for myself, I could learn a lot more about Filipinos and Southeast Asians. And we tend to be monoculture in terms we focus in on the cultural issues that pertain to our background. But I think it'd be nice to learn about other Asian cultures. So have a symposium to help the two generations understand what life is like in their Asian country and what life is like here, so the two generations can come to a mutual understanding.
Thank you. I might have to add it. We still have 10 people left, and exactly at 2:15, we have to take photos. So if you can just delete commentary and just give the list, that would be great. Thank you. Next, James, you model it.
Yeah, I'm James Yu, and I had a great time with our group. All right, here's our list, and you guys either do it or you don't. I think we emphasize field education is important, getting pastors and teachers involved and the churches involved, and also we believe in dialogue. We need to create platform for community. This dialogue is not just internally, but also external dialogues, not only within the Asian American community, but also externally outside the community. And how do we do that? I think that's something Isaac and Fuller may want to spend time figuring out. Mentoring program, somebody mentioned already, we'll skip that. Classes such as Asian American history, etc. And I think one thing nobody mentioned so far is I believe we brought up the issue of partnership. If it's a resource issue, I think we need to look at different schools and their strengths and weaknesses and work together in partnership. I think that's something Fuller could consider. More funding, more money for our research. Okay. For Asian American needs, and preferably go to Isaac, right, of course. Create a platform for Asian American to network together, and I think that's what we're doing here, and we'll continue doing that, and are we done? No. Last one, assist Asian American churches to be missional. I think by becoming missional, you really help the bridging elements within the different cultures. All right, thanks.
I'm an American Baptist pastor, and Baptist preachers are fond of three-point sermons. And so I just summarized our sharing time and our discussion into 3 points. One is in the topic of theology. We said that good theology is good theology. That means it has a transcendent quality, whether it comes from a white person or a black person or an Asian person. And so attached to that is we discussed about the centrality of scriptures in our own personal discipline and in all the things that we do in church. And by the way, our group is on the future of AA pastoral leadership. And so we said that we need to, that our pastors need to be scholars and experts of the scriptures, and that we need to learn to let scriptures interpret our culture, rather than vice versa. And so what we want, or what we'd like to ask from Fuller and Isaac, is to help our pastors to be grounded in scriptures. And one way to do that is to invite them to participate in theological fellowships that would produce scholarly writings or articles that would inform church ministry. The second thing we talked about was on mentoring. Somebody had already mentioned about that, but there is a need and importance of that for us. And also, thirdly, it's maybe in the group of continuing education that majority of our pastors are pastoring small or medium-sized churches, and not really, only very few could be considered a mega church. And so what we'd like to hear are voices and stories and struggles of pastors who are serving in small and medium-sized churches. Thank you.
I had the most brilliant group in the room, and we were truly Asian because we wrote on the sticky side of the page. So we did everything backwards. Actually, a lot of what we said has already been mentioned, so I won't, repeat those things. But I do want to say that when we talked about the things about mentoring, about experienced pastors spending time with seminarians, we spent a lot of time talking about the more practical things in ministry. It just so happened that our group was a collection of people who minister to youth, people who do counseling, people who do very personal kinds of ministry. And we felt it would be beneficial if there are voices that could speak into seminarians' lives on these very practical parts of ministry. How do you preach to a 16-year-old? How do you do your clergy tax? How do you buy a copy machine? Or how do you counsel a family where there's been all kinds of situations going on? And so, we believe that the mentoring, the training, the discipling, it has to be in very practical areas of ministry that would be useful to people, right out of seminary.
Thank you.
Well, my name is Ken Kong, and I'm just going to go by it. Well, the first thing we talked about was cultural sensitivity between the first generation and the second generation. So both sides having cultural sensitivity towards one another, and how that can be provided either through Isaac or Fuller. The second was providing space for our leaders, our next generation leader, second generation leader, to grow. And so how do we begin to empower and provide space for them to grow? Third point is to host film festivals, explore the arts, creative arts, technology arts, and that's a way to attract next generation. So that's it. Thank you.
First one's already been mentioned. Oh, my name's Tommy Joe. But the first one's already been mentioned, mentoring. What's the second one? I can't even read it from here. Learning different models of church ministry. So we talked about, I appreciate that we talked about not just having one, or you don't have to leave, or not leaving, those issues. I think we need to affirm multiple models of ministry. I'm going to do it this way. The second issue is, a third issue is the generational issues is not just an issue of first and second generation. Generational issues have to do with multi-generational issues, not just first and second, third, and beyond. And as we acculturize, those will be some of the issues that we're dealing with. And the last one is integration of education on a seminary level. I know there's been great attempts already to combine missiology and psychology and theology together, but when you throw in the component of culture and Asian American identity in there, that's going to be another multifaceted thing. So we want to talk about integration.